The call came on a Tuesday morning. You're being promoted to major, and we're putting you in charge of reforming military family policies. The same systems that had failed me, the policies my father had manipulated to silence assault victims, I was now going to rewrite all of them. The troublemaker he tried to silence would now have a platform reaching every military family in America. The autumn wind cuts through Arlington National Cemetery as I stand beside my mother, watching 6 soldiers in dress blues approach with military precision. My father's casket gleams under the gray October sky, draped in the same flag that once covered heroes I actually respected. Colonel James Reeves gets the full military honors he always demanded: the folded flag, the rifle salute, the bugler playing taps from a distant hill. I should feel something. Grief maybe. Relief possibly. Instead, I feel empty, like I've been holding my breath for 32 years, and still haven't figured out how to exhale. The honor guard captain approaches my mother with the first folded flag, his white gloves pristine against the red, white, and blue fabric. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your husband's honorable and faithful service. Hey beautiful soul. Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me, where in this big beautiful world are you watching from? Mom takes the flag with trembling hands, and I steady her elbow as she whispers thank you through her tears. This part one expected. 25 years of service, 2 combat deployments, a career that ended with his heart attack at 58. Standard protocol for a colonel's funeral. But then something happens that makes my blood freeze. A second honor guard member steps forward with another folded flag. My stomach drops. This isn't normal. There's only supposed to be one flag, one presentation, one moment of closure. But here's this young sergeant, maybe 23 years old, holding another triangle of fabric like it weighs more than the first. "Ma'am," he says, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of family, friends, and military colleagues, "I have the honor of presenting you with this flag, which was flown yesterday at General Patricia Sterling's Medal of Honor ceremony." The words hit me like shrapnel. Mom looks confused, glancing between me and the soldier. Around us, people start murmuring. Medal of Honor ceremony? Yesterday? The timing makes no sense until the sergeant continues. This flag honors the extraordinary service of Captain Maya Reeves, whose classified intelligence operations in Afghanistan prevented multiple terrorist attacks and saved an estimated 47 American lives. The cemetery falls silent except for the wind through the oak trees. My mother's face goes white. Her hands shake as she accepts the second flag, and I watch her mind racing to process what she's hearing. Behind us, I can feel my father's military friends turning to stare, their confusion mixing with something that looks like recognition. They're finally connecting dots they never had pieces for. For 18 months, my father told anyone who would listen that I was wasting my potential overseas, that I was too stubborn and reckless to handle real responsibility. He died believing I was the family disappointment, the daughter who threw away every advantage he'd given me. The classification levels on my missions meant I couldn't defend myself, couldn't explain why I was always being transferred, couldn't tell him that every failure he criticized was actually a promotion into more dangerous, more critical work. The honor guard captain continues. General Sterling wanted the family to know that Captain Reeves' service represents the highest ideals of military excellence and sacrifice. I stare at the second flag in my mother's arms, this symbol of recognition that came 24 hours too late for the man who spent years convinced I was a disappointment. My father died never knowing that his failed daughter had just received one of the military's highest honors, that the woman he publicly wished death upon had actually spent 2 years preventing death for others. Mom looks up at me with tears streaming down her face, holding both flags against her chest. In her eyes, I see the question she can't ask out loud. How long has this been true? How much didn't we know? The crowd of mourners shifts uncomfortably, realizing they've witnessed something unprecedented. Military funerals don't usually include revelations about classified heroism. This moment was planned, orchestrated by people who outrank everyone here, people who decided that some truths are more important than protocol. Standing there with my mother clutching 2 flags representing 2 completely different versions of our family's military legacy, I finally understand something I've been trying to figure out for years. My father's approval was never actually available to me. It didn't matter how much I achieved or how perfectly I served. He needed me to be small to feel big, needed me to fail to confirm his worldview about women in combat, needed me to be grateful for opportunities one earned myself. But the military saw everything he refused to see. They kept score when he wouldn't. And now, at his funeral, they're making sure the record shows the truth about both of us. 18 months earlier, I stand in the departure terminal at Fort Bragg, watching other military families say their goodbyes. Around me, children cling to their deploying parents, spouses exchange promises to call every day, and grandparents wipe away tears while trying to look proud. The terminal buzzes with that mixture of patriotic pride and heartbreak that defines military departures. My unit, the 525th Military Intelligence Brigade, clusters near Gate 7, our desert camouflage uniforms crisp and our gear bags lined up like soldiers themselves. We're heading to Bagram Airfield for what everyone thinks is a standard intelligence support deployment. What they don't know is that 6 of us have been selected for something else entirely, something that required background investigation so deep they interviewed my 3rd grade teacher. My parents arrived 30 minutes ago. Mom immediately pulled me into one of her fierce hugs, the kind that tries to protect you from everything the world might throw at you. She whispered all the things mothers say before deployments. Be careful, trust your training, come home safe. Her eyes were red, but she smiled when she told me how proud she was. My father stood apart, checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. Colonel James Reeves, in his dress blue uniform with ribbons that tell the story of a career built on following orders and maintaining appearance. Even in civilian settings, he wears his military bearing-like armor, shoulders squared and jaw set in perpetual disapproval. Today, that disapproval is directed entirely at me. Maya, he says when I approach, his voice carrying that clipped tone he uses when he's about to deliver judgment. I suppose you think this deployment makes you some kind of hero. Other families glance our way. Sergeant Martinez, my best friend since officer candidate school, raises an eyebrow from where she's saying goodbye to her girlfriend. Lieutenant Sean, our intelligence analyst, pretends not to listen while hugging his parents. I think it makes me a soldier doing her job. I reply, keeping my voice level. Your job. He laughs, but there's no humor in it. Running around playing spy games while real officers handle actual combat operations. You've been in the Army 6 years, Maya, and what do you have to show for it? No combat deployments, no line unit experience, no real leadership positions. The words sting because I can't defend against them. Everything I've actually accomplished for the past 3 years is classified above his clearance level. The commendations in my file that he'll never see, the operations I've supported that prevented attacks on American soil, the reason I was selected for this particular mission, all of it hidden behind security classifications that make my achievements invisible to my own father. James, my mother says quietly, placing a hand on his arm. Not here. Not now. But he's just getting started. His voice gets louder, carrying across the departure area where other soldiers and families are trying to have their own private moments. Not here? Elena, when exactly am I supposed to tell her the truth? When she comes back from another assignment she can't talk about. Another classified excuse for why she's not advancing her career like every other officer her age. Heads are turning now. My unit members pretend to focus on their own conversations, but I can feel them listening. These are people I'll be living and working with for the next year, people whose respect and trust one need in potentially life or death situations. And my own father is systematically destroying my credibility in front of them. You want to know what I really think about this deployment? He steps closer, his voice dropping to that cold whisper he uses when he wants his words to cut deeper. I hope it finally teaches you some humility. I hope you realize you're not as special as you think you are. The terminal seems to hold its breath. Even the gate agent stops her announcements. I hope you die overseas. The words hang in the air like smoke from an explosion. Around us, conversations stop entirely. A mother with a baby stares openly. 2 soldiers from another unit exchange shocked glances. Sergeant Martinez actually takes a step toward us before catching herself. My mother gasps, "James, you don't mean that." But his eyes are locked on mine, and I can see that he absolutely means it. This isn't anger or frustration or fear for my safety. This is a father telling his daughter he wishes she would die rather than continue to exist in a way that disappoints him. Maybe then, he continues, You'll stop embarrassing this family with your delusions of grandeur. I feel something break inside my chest, not my heart exactly, but something structural and important. The part of me that kept hoping for his approval, that kept trying to prove my worth in ways he might understand, simply gives up. Goodbye, Dad, I say and turn toward my unit. Behind me, I hear my mother crying and my father's footsteps walking away. I don't look back to see if he watches me board the plane. I don't need to know. As I join my unit, Lieutenant Chun catches my eye and gives me the smallest nod of support. Sergeant Martinez squeezes my shoulder as we line up to board. They heard everything, but their faces show respect, not judgment. They understand that some battles aren't worth fighting, and some people aren't worth pleasing. I board the plane to Afghanistan carrying my father's curse like extra gear, wondering if the weight of it will make me stronger or just make everything harder to carry. The first crack in my relationship with my father happened on a cold February morning during my senior year at West Point. I was 21, 3 months from graduation, and still naive enough to believe that doing the right thing would make my father proud. I remember walking across the snow-covered parade ground toward the superintendent's office, my dress gray uniform pressed to perfection, the honor code ring heavy on my finger. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. For simple principles that defined everything I thought I understood about military integrity, the meeting I was heading to would change everything. 3 weeks earlier, I'd become aware of something that made my stomach turn. Cadet First Class Brandon Walsh, a football player with connections throughout the Academy's old boy network, had been systematically assaulting female underclassmen. Not just inappropriate comments or unwanted advances, actual assault. 2 sophomore cadets had confided in me separately, both too terrified to report it officially because Walsh's father was a 2-star general and his uncle sat on the board of visitors. The honor code was clear. I couldn't tolerate this. I had to report it. What I didn't expect was my father's reaction when the Academy called him as part of their initial inquiry. As the daughter of a career officer, any honor code investigation involving me would automatically trigger family notification. It was protocol, designed to keep military families informed about serious matters affecting their children. I was in my room studying contract law when my roommate knocked. "Reeves, you've got a call. Your father." The conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I know because I stared at my alarm clock the entire time, watching the red numbers change while my father systematically destroyed my faith in everything I thought he stood for. "Maya, I just got off the phone with Colonel Morrison," he said without preamble. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm reporting a serious honor code violation, sir. It's my duty under Dash." "Your duty? Your duty is to graduate from West Point without creating problems that reflect poorly on this family." His voice carried that cold fury I'd learned to recognize as a child. "Do you have any idea what you're risking? Brandon Walsh is a legacy cadet. His family has been serving this country since before you were born. Dad, he's assaulting female cadets. Multiple victims. I can't just ignore Dash. You can and you will. Maya, listen to me very carefully. You're about to graduate from the most prestigious military academy in the world. You have opportunities that most officers would kill for. Don't throw that away because you want to play feminist crusader." The words hit me like ice water. Feminist crusader. As if preventing sexual assault was some kind of political agenda rather than basic human decency. "These women deserve justice," I said quietly. "These women need to learn how to handle themselves in a man's world. You think the real army is going to coddle you? You think when you're deployed overseas, you can run crying to headquarters every time someone makes you uncomfortable?" I stood there in my tiny dorm room, staring at the portrait of General MacArthur on my wall, and realized my father saw military service entirely differently than I did. For him, it was about maintaining hierarchy, protecting the system, preserving the brotherhood. For me, it was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. "Dad, what if it was me? What if I was the one being assaulted?" The pause lasted so long I thought the connection had dropped. "Maya, if you were my daughter and you were strong enough, smart enough, and capable enough, you wouldn't put yourself in that situation in the first place." That night, I submitted my formal report anyway. I detailed everything the victims had told me, provided witness statements, and requested a full investigation. I signed my name at the bottom with the same confidence I'd signed my oath to defend the Constitution. 2 weeks later, I was quietly transferred to a different company. My academic standing mysteriously dropped due to administrative discrepancies that were never fully explained. Brandon Walsh graduated with honors and received a prestigious assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division. The investigation was quietly buried under a pile of procedural technicalities. The victims were told their accusations couldn't be substantiated without additional evidence. Walsh's record remained spotless. My father called the night before graduation to congratulate me on finally learning to pick my battles wisely. He never asked about the women I tried to protect. He never acknowledged that I'd done anything except create unnecessary drama. But something else happened that I didn't discover until years later. My report, although buried, was filed in Walsh's permanent record. 3 years later, when he assaulted a lieutenant at Fort Bragg, investigators found my West Point report and used it to establish a pattern of behavior. Walsh was court-martialed, dismissed from the Army, and served 18 months in military prison. The women he assaulted at Fort Bragg got justice because I'd refused to stay silent at West Point. But my father never knew that, and wouldn't have cared if he did. For him, I'd violated the unwritten rule that you protect the brotherhood above all else, even when the brotherhood protects predators. That February morning when I walked across the parade ground to file my report, I was still Colonel James Reeves' daughter, trying to make him proud by upholding military values. By the time I graduated, I understood that we had fundamentally different definitions of honor, integrity, and what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself. For 6 years after West Point, I lived with the weight of my father's disappointment like a constant ache. Every family gathering, every phone call, every chance encounter with his military friends became an opportunity for him to explain where I'd gone wrong. "Maya's having trouble finding her place in the Army," he'd tell his poker buddies, shaking his head with that practiced expression of paternal concern. "Keeps getting transferred around. Can't seem to stick with anything long enough to make real progress." At my cousin's wedding, I watched him work the reception, moving from table to table of retired officers and their wives, sharing his version of my career struggles. "She's bouncing between assignments like she can't handle the responsibility. I keep telling her she needs to focus, but you know how stubborn she can be." The truth was so classified I couldn't even hint at it without risking a court-martial. What my father saw as professional instability was actually the most elite career track the Army offered. Every transfer he criticized was a promotion into deeper levels of classified operations. While he complained that I wasn't deployed to combat zones like real soldiers, I was actually running intelligence operations in places that didn't officially exist on any deployment roster. My first assignment after West Point looked like a desk job at Fort Gordon, analyzing satellite imagery. My father called it playing with computers instead of leading soldiers. What he didn't know was that my analysis prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks on American bases overseas. The commendation letter in my file, classified secret, praised my exceptional analytical skills that saved countless American lives. When I was transferred to Fort Huachuca after 18 months, my father saw it as evidence that I couldn't handle long-term assignments. "She's already moving again," he told my mother during one of their weekly calls that I happened to overhear. "Good officers don't job hop like that. It shows lack of commitment." Fort Huachuca was where I was recruited for Task Force Orange, a joint CIA military intelligence unit that operated under such deep cover that our own families couldn't know we existed. My official record showed routine intelligence work. My actual work involved infiltrating terrorist networks and gathering intelligence that informed drone strikes and special operations raids. The transfer to Afghanistan that triggered my father's airport curse looked like another example of my inability to advance in stateside positions. In reality, I'd been selected for Operation Nightingale, a classified mission to embed with local intelligence sources and identify high-value targets planning attacks on American interests. While my father told anyone who would listen that I was wasting my potential on spy games, I was actually doing exactly what every intelligence officer dreams of: preventing attacks before they happen, saving lives through information warfare, and building networks that would protect American forces for years to come. The cruelest irony was that my father's vision of military success, combat deployments, visible leadership positions, traditional career progression, was exactly what my classified work was designed to avoid. The more effective I became at intelligence operations, the more invisible my achievements had to remain. Success in my field meant that nobody, including my own father, could ever know what I'd accomplished. Every family dinner became a performance where I had to pretend his criticism stung because I couldn't defend myself. When he'd lecture me about real military leadership, I'd bite my tongue instead of mentioning that I was briefing generals and making recommendations that shaped military policy. When he'd suggest I wasn't cut out for real responsibility, I couldn't tell him that lives literally depended on my decisions. The Army had given me the highest security clearances available, trusted me with intelligence that could affect national security, and placed me in positions where failure meant American soldiers dying. But to my father, I was just another disappointment who couldn't measure up to his vision of what a military officer should be. My mother tried to defend me sometimes in her gentle way. "James, maybe Maya's work is important in ways we don't understand. Elena, if it was important, we'd be allowed to understand it. This classified nonsense is just an excuse for mediocrity. Real officers don't hide behind security clearances." That was my father's fundamental misunderstanding of modern military service. He believed that anything worth doing would be visible, measurable, and suitable for public recognition. He couldn't grasp that some of the most crucial military work happens in shadows, that the most successful operations are the ones nobody ever hears about. For years, I carried the burden of his disappointment while simultaneously carrying the weight of responsibilities he couldn't imagine. I saved lives he'd never know about while listening to him explain to relatives why I was such a failure. I prevented attacks that would have made international headlines while enduring his lectures about my lack of real achievement. The security classifications that protected national interests also protected his ignorance about my actual capabilities. Every success I couldn't share became evidence of my supposed inadequacy. Every life I saved remained invisible to the man whose approval I'd spent my entire life seeking. But the classification levels that kept my father in the dark about my achievements also meant that when the truth finally emerged, it would come from the highest levels of military authority, people whose word he couldn't dismiss or diminish. The morning after my father's airport humiliation, I sat in his 130 transport plane somewhere over the Atlantic, watching the sun rise through a small porthole window. Around me, my unit slept in the uncomfortable canvas seats, catching rest before we landed at Ramstein Air Base for refueling. The drone of the engine should have been soothing, but I couldn't stop hearing my father's voice echoing in the cargo hold. "I hope you die overseas." That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and opened the family group chat that had been buzzing for months with deployment updates, care package coordination, and my mother's anxious questions about communication schedules. My thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before I typed a simple message. "Landed safely. We'll be in touch when possible." Then I left the group chat. It felt like stepping out of a burning building. Suddenly, I wasn't carrying the weight of my father's expectations, his disappointment, or his need to diminish my achievements to make himself feel better. I wasn't responsible for managing his emotions or defending my career choices to someone who was committed to misunderstanding them. When we reached Bagram Airfield 3 days later, I had 17 missed calls from my mother and 43 text messages ranging from worried to pleading to angry. I read them all, then deleted every one without responding. Lieutenant Chun found me on the roof of our housing unit 2 weeks into the deployment, staring at the Hindu Kush Mountains in the distance. "You okay, Captain? Your mom's been calling the unit's family readiness group." "I'm fine," I said, and meant it for the first time in years. "You want to talk about what happened at the airport?" I considered it. Chun was a good officer and a better friend. He'd seen my father's performance, witnessed the public humiliation, and hadn't treated me any differently since. But talking about it would mean relitigating decisions I'd already made, explaining choices that didn't need explanation. "Some people are committed to misunderstanding you," I said finally. "My father has spent 6 years convinced that I'm failing at everything I touch. No amount of evidence is going to change his mind because his opinion isn't actually based on my performance. It's based on his need to see me as less than I am." Chun nodded slowly. "So you're done trying to prove him wrong?" "I'm done trying to prove anything to anyone who's already decided what they want to believe." The silence that followed felt different from the heavy quiet that had followed me around for years. This was the silence of someone who had stopped carrying a weight they were never supposed to lift in the first place. My mother's calls became less frequent as the weeks passed. When she did reach out, Her messages shifted from pleading for communication to expressing worry about my father's reaction to my silence. She was still trying to manage the family dynamics, still trying to fix relationships that one person couldn't repair alone. I started sending her brief updates every 2 weeks. Not because she demanded them, but because she deserved to know I was safe. The updates were factual, professional, and devoid of personal details. Mission proceeding as planned. Health and morale good. We'll contact again in 2 weeks. The family that had once been my source of approval-seeking anxiety became background noise. Without their voices in my head questioning every decision, criticizing every achievement, and demanding explanations for choices I couldn't defend, I discovered something remarkable. I was actually excellent at my job. For the first time in my military career, I wasn't splitting my energy between serving my country and managing my father's disappointment. I wasn't crafting careful explanations for why my assignments looked different from his expectations. I wasn't carrying the emotional labor of a relationship with someone who had already decided I wasn't worth understanding. The work became clearer, the decisions easier, the leadership more natural. When you stop trying to prove your worth to people who are invested in not seeing it, you discover how much energy you've been wasting on an impossible task. My unit noticed the change. I became more decisive in briefings, more confident in my assessments, and more focused on the mission at hand. Sergeant Martinez mentioned that I seemed lighter somehow, and she was right. I had finally put down a burden I should never have been carrying. 3 months into my deployment, I started what I privately called the project. Not for revenge or vindication, but for something more important, the historical record. It began when Sergeant Martinez found me in our makeshift office at Forward Operating Base Shank, carefully photographing commendation letters with my personal phone. The documents were unclassified portions of my service record. The parts that could be preserved without compromising operational security. "What are you doing, Captain?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Building a file," I said, holding up a letter of commendation from my Fort Gordon commander. "My father thinks I'm a failure. When I'm gone, there should be a record of what actually happened." Martinez nodded slowly. She'd heard about the airport incident, and like most of my unit, she understood that some families don't deserve the soldiers they produce. "You want help with that?" That's how the archive really began to grow. Martinez helped me contact other women from West Point who had experienced similar treatment after reporting sexual assault. Through encrypted communications and careful networking, I gathered testimonies from 7 former cadets who had been quietly punished for speaking up about abuse. Their stories followed the same pattern. Report assault, face retaliation, watch the perpetrator's career flourish while their own stalled. I photographed every award certificate I'd received, every performance evaluation that praised my work, every piece of evidence that contradicted my father's narrative about my failing career. The classified achievements would have to remain hidden, but there was enough unclassified material to paint a clear picture of professional excellence. Lieutenant Chun, our intelligence analyst, helped me document the systematic nature of the retaliation I'd faced after the West Point incident. He showed me how to trace the administrative discrepancies that had affected my academic standing, how to identify the unusual patterns in my assignment history that suggested outside interference. "Your father had friends at West Point," Chen observed, reviewing printouts of my academic records. "Look at these grade changes. They all happened within 2 weeks of your honor code report. Someone with influence made some calls." I saved everything in multiple locations. Encrypted cloud storage, hard copies in a safety deposit box back home, and digital files with Martinez and Chan as backup. This wasn't just about my story anymore. It was about preserving evidence of how the system protected perpetrators and punished women who spoke up. The most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Williams, who had worked in the West Point administration during my time there, was now stationed at Bagram. During a chance encounter at the dining facility, he pulled me aside. "Captain Reeves, I always wondered what happened to you after that Brandon Walsh situation," he said quietly. "I kept copies of some documents from that investigation. Thought you might want to know the truth about how it all went down." The files Williams provided showed exactly how my father had used his influence to bury my report. Phone logs, Email records and internal memos revealed a coordinated effort to discredit my accusations and protect Walsh's career. My father hadn't just failed to support me, he had actively worked to ensure my report would be ignored. One email, sent from my father's official Army account to the West Point superintendent, was particularly damning. "Colonel Morrison, my daughter has always been prone to dramatic overreactions. I trust you'll handle this matter with appropriate discretion. Some young women struggle with the demands of academy life and create unnecessary complications." Reading those words, seeing my own father characterize my courage as dramatic overreaction, crystallized something important. This wasn't about one family's dysfunction. This was about institutional systems that protected predators and silenced victims, systems that my father had actively participated in maintaining. I added Williams' documents to the archive, along with follow-up research about Brandon Walsh's eventual court-martial and conviction. The file now told a complete story. How reporting assault led to retaliation, how family connections enabled cover-ups, and how speaking truth to power required accepting that some people, including your own family, would choose protecting the system over protecting you. The archive became my insurance policy against historical erasure. Whatever happened to me in Afghanistan, whatever narrative my father continued to spread about my career, the truth would be preserved. Other women would be able to see that they weren't alone, that the pattern of retaliation was systematic, and that speaking up had consequences but also eventual vindication. 6 months into my deployment, I received an unusual message through official channels. "Captain Reeves, report to Secure Communications Facility Alpha for priority video conference at 1400 hours." The message was signed by someone I'd only heard about in whispered conversations among intelligence officers, General Patricia Sterling, the first woman to command U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command. The secure facility was a windowless concrete bunker buried beneath our forward operating base, lined with copper mesh to prevent electronic surveillance. When the encrypted video connection established, I found myself looking at a woman whose reputation preceded her by decades. General Sterling had served 3 combat tours, survived 2 assassination attempts, and earned her stars by revolutionizing how the Army conducted intelligence operations in hostile territory. "Captain Reeves," she said without preamble, "I've been reviewing your operational reports. Exceptional work. Your analysis of the Kandahar network prevented what would have been a coordinated attack on 3 separate bases." "Thank you, General. I'm not calling to offer congratulations. I'm calling because I received an interesting phone call 3 weeks ago." Her expression darkened slightly. "Your father contacted my office directly, suggesting that you might be inflating your operational reports to make yourself look more valuable than you actually are." The words hit me like physical blows. Even while I was deployed in a combat zone running operations that saved American lives, my father was actively trying to undermine my credibility with my own command structure. "General, I can assure you that all my reports are accurate and verified by Dash." She held up a hand. "Captain, I've been in this business for 30 years. I know accurate intelligence when I see it. What concerns me is that your own father would attempt to sabotage your career while you're serving in harm's way." General Sterling leaned forward, her steel-gray eyes focused intently on the camera. "I did something I rarely do. I called Colonel Reeves back and attempted to explain, within appropriate security parameters, the significance of your contributions to ongoing operations. Do you know what his response was?" I shook my head, though I suspected I didn't want to hear the answer. "He told me that you've always been manipulative, and that female officers often exaggerate their accomplishments to advance their careers. He suggested that I was being fooled by what he called your victim narrative." The secure bunker suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. My father hadn't just failed to support me, he was actively working to destroy my reputation with senior leadership while I was deployed. "Captain, I want you to understand something," General Sterling continued. "In my experience, officers who truly manipulate the system don't end up in forward operating bases running high-risk intelligence operations. They stay stateside, play politics, and avoid anything that might damage their carefully constructed careers." She paused, consulting something off-camera. "I've spoken with every commanding officer you've served under since West Point. To a person, they describe you as competent, courageous, and completely trustworthy. Your operational success rate is in the 96th percentile. Your risk assessments have been proven accurate in every case where we've had subsequent intelligence to verify them. I appreciate your confidence, General. This isn't about confidence, Captain. This is about recognition. Your father may not understand what you do, but I do. The intelligence community understands. And we're going to make sure your contributions are appropriately documented and recognized. General Sterling's expression softened slightly. I had a father who thought women belonged in supporting roles, not leadership positions. He died believing I was wasting my potential playing soldier instead of finding a husband and settling down. Some men of that generation can't expand their vision of what their daughters might achieve. Did it ever stop hurting? I asked, surprising myself with the question. No, she said simply. But it stopped mattering. When you know your worth, when your peers recognize your contributions, when the work itself validates your choices, other people's limitations become their problem, not yours. The general spent the next 20 minutes outlining her plans to ensure my achievements received appropriate recognition within the intelligence community. She was personally overseeing the documentation of my operational successes and had already initiated the process for several classified commendations. Captain, your father called me expecting to find a commanding officer who would be receptive to his concerns about his daughter's performance. Instead, he found someone who's going to make sure your actual record speaks louder than his doubts. When the call ended, I sat in that bunker for several minutes, processing what had just happened. For the first time in my military career, someone with real authority had not only seen my worth but was actively working to protect and promote it. General Sterling wasn't just validating my work. She was using her position to ensure that my father's attempts at sabotage would fail completely. After General Sterling's revelation about my father's sabotage attempts, I spent 3 sleepless nights in my bunk staring at the ceiling of our housing unit. The sound of generators humming outside mixed with the distant pop of small arms fire from the training range, but all I could hear was my father's voice telling a general that I was manipulative and prone to creating victim narratives. On the 4th night, I sat down at my laptop and began to write. Colonel James Reeves. I started, then deleted it. Too formal. Dad. I tried next, then deleted that too. The word felt foreign, unearned. Finally, I settled on James. For 6 hours, I poured everything onto the screen. Every truth he'd refused to see, every achievement he'd dismissed, every way his need to diminish me had damaged not just our relationship, but the Army's ability to protect women from predators like Brandon Walsh. I wrote about West Point, about how his intervention hadn't protected the family reputation, but had enabled a serial predator to assault more women. I detailed the classified operations I couldn't tell him about, the lives I'd saved, the attacks I'd prevented. I explained how his public humiliation at the airport had affected my unit's morale, and how his calls to my commanding officers constituted inappropriate interference with military operations. You told General Sterling that I create victim narratives, I wrote. But what you've created is something worse, a perpetrator narrative. A story where the woman who reports assault is the problem, where the daughter who excels in ways you don't understand is the disappointment, where anyone who threatens your worldview must be diminished or destroyed. I wrote about the phone calls I'd stopped returning, the family gatherings I'd started avoiding, the way I'd learned to protect my achievements from his need to criticize them. I explained that my silence wasn't punishment but self-preservation, that some relationships are too toxic to maintain even when they're supposed to be the most important ones in your life. I spent 6 years trying to prove my worth to someone who was committed to not seeing it. I continued. I gave you opportunities to know the real version of your daughter, and you chose instead to cling to a version that confirmed your biases about women in the military. That's your loss, not mine. The letter grew to 12 pages. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment when he'd chosen his prejudices over his daughter. I wrote about watching other fathers support their military children, while mine actively worked to undermine mine. I wrote about the relief I'd felt when I stopped seeking his approval, and the professional growth that had followed. When I finished, I read the entire letter 3 times. It was comprehensive, devastating, and absolutely true. Every fact could be verified. Every criticism was earned. Every accusation was supported by evidence. Then I saved it to a folder labeled "Never Send" and closed the laptop. The next morning, Sergeant Martinez found me on the roof again, watching the sunrise over the mountains. You look different, she said, settling beside me with 2 cups of coffee. More settled somehow. I wrote him a letter, I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Are you going to send it? I considered the question seriously. No. Writing it was enough. It crystallized something for me. The difference between wanting someone to understand you and needing them to understand you. Martinez nodded. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to someone is nothing at all. That was exactly right. The letter had served its purpose without being sent. It forced me to articulate every truth I'd been carrying, every wound I'd been nursing, every way his limitations had affected my life. But sending it would have been giving him another opportunity to dismiss my perspective, to find new ways to misunderstand or minimize my experience. Instead, I filed the letter away with the rest of my documentation, not as evidence for some future confrontation, but as a complete accounting of our relationship that didn't require his acknowledgement to be valid. Some truths don't need to be shared to be powerful. Some conversations are more effective when they happen entirely in your own mind. The letter became my closure, a full expression of everything I needed to say to someone who had lost the right to hear it. Writing those 12 pages taught me that I didn't need his understanding, his apology, or his approval to move forward. I just needed to stop giving him opportunities to disappoint me. From that day forward, my father became a stranger whose opinions about my life were irrelevant. The letter I never sent had accomplished something no conversation ever could have. It freed me from caring what he thought. While Maya maintains silence with her family, the military begins quietly correcting the record. Her classified achievements start receiving appropriate recognition within security-cleared circles. Other officers who witnessed her father's treatment of her begin speaking up about the inappropriate nature of his public criticisms. An investigation into the West Point incident is reopened, leading to policy changes about how sexual assault reports are handled. Maya's courage in reporting abuse, even when it was buried, becomes part of institutional memory and training materials. The military community begins to understand that Colonel Reeves' treatment of his daughter reflected poorly on his leadership and judgment, not on Maya's character or capabilities. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 months before the end of my deployment. I was reviewing intelligence reports in our secure facility when my encrypted phone buzzed with a priority message. Report to General Sterling's office via secure video conference at 1500 hours. Bring your service record and security clearance documentation. My first thought was that something had gone wrong. Priority calls from general officers rarely brought good news for captains. I spent the afternoon wondering what I'd done wrong, what operation had been compromised, what mistake I'd made that required explanation at the highest levels. When the video connection established, General Sterling wasn't alone. Beside her sat Colonel Patricia Hayes, whom I recognized as the director of the Army's Military Family Life Counselor Program, and Major General Robert Chun, no relation to my Lieutenant Chun, who oversaw personnel policy for Intelligence Command. Captain Reeves, General Sterling began, we're calling to discuss your next assignment. You're being promoted to Major, effective immediately, and we're offering you a position that I think will interest you. The promotion was unexpected but not unprecedented. I'd been performing above my rank for months, and my operational successes warranted advancement. But the presence of Colonel Hayes suggested this wasn't a standard intelligence assignment. Major Reeves, Colonel Hayes continued, we want you to develop and lead the Army's new Family Advocacy and Military Justice Reform Initiative. Your background in intelligence analysis, combined with your personal experience with institutional barriers to reporting abuse, makes you uniquely qualified for this position. I felt the room tilt slightly. They were offering me oversight of the very systems that had failed me at West Point, the processes my father had manipulated to protect Brandon Walsh and silence me. Major General Chun leaned forward. This position carries significant authority, Major. You'll be reviewing and updating policies around family harassment, abuse reporting, and the intersection of military justice with family dynamics. You'll have a staff of 12 officers and direct reporting access to the Secretary of the Army. Additionally, General Sterling added, part of your mandate will be developing new protocols for handling honor code violations at military academies, particularly those involving sexual assault. We want systematic changes that prevent the kind of institutional protection that allowed problematic cases to be buried in the past. The irony was overwhelming. The daughter who had been dismissed as a troublemaker, who had been punished for reporting assault, who had watched her academic record sabotaged for speaking truth to power, was now being placed in charge of reforming the entire system. "There's more," Colonel Hayes said. "Your position will include oversight of a new program called Military Family Integrity Standards. Essentially, you'll be developing policies to prevent family members from inappropriately interfering with service members' careers, including guidelines for when such interference crosses the line into harassment or sabotage." I thought about my father's calls to General Sterling, his attempts to undermine my credibility while I was deployed. Under the new policies I would be developing, his behavior would be formally prohibited and subject to disciplinary action. "The position is based at the Pentagon," Major General Chung continued, "with frequent travel to military installations for policy implementation and training. You'll be briefing congressional committees on military family issues and working directly with the Department of Justice on cases that involve both military and civilian jurisdictions." General Sterling's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught something that looked like satisfaction in her eyes. "Major, this isn't just about policy development. You'll have the authority to investigate specific cases where military families have been failed by existing systems. You'll be able to reopen cases, review decisions, and ensure that justice delayed doesn't become justice denied." I sat in that bunker in Afghanistan, processing the magnitude of what they were offering. Not just a promotion, but the power to prevent other military children from experiencing what I had endured. The authority to ensure that reporting assault would lead to protection rather than retaliation. The ability to create systematic safeguards against the kind of institutional manipulation my father had orchestrated. "The position comes with challenges," Colonel Hayes warned. "You'll be implementing changes that some senior officers will resist. There are people who benefited from the old systems, who see reform as criticism of their leadership. You'll need to be prepared for pushback." "I've been preparing for pushback my entire military career," I replied. "Then you understand what we're asking," General Sterling said. "We want you to build the system you needed when you were 21 years old. We want you to ensure that when the next Maya Reeves reports assault or faces family sabotage, the institution responds with protection and support, rather than retaliation and cover-up." The promotion ceremony happened via video conference the following week, with my unit gathered in the same bunker where I'd first spoken with General Sterling. As Lieutenant Colonel Morrison pinned the major's oak leaves to my uniform, I thought about the 21-year-old cadet who had walked across the West Point parade ground to report Brandon Walsh. She could never have imagined that her failure to stay silent would eventually lead to this moment. The authority to reform the very system that had failed her, the power to ensure other women wouldn't face the same institutional betrayal she had endured. The woman my father had tried to diminish was now going to shape military policy at the highest levels. The troublemaker he tried to silence would now have a platform that reached every military family in America. 6 months into my new role at the Pentagon, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The West Point superintendent requested that I deliver the keynote address at the Academy's annual Honor Code Symposium. The same institution where my father had helped bury my assault report now wanted me to speak about integrity, courage, and moral leadership. Standing at the podium in Eisenhower Hall, looking out at an audience of cadets, faculty, and senior officers, I felt the weight of everything that had brought me to this moment. Some of the faculty members had been there when I was a cadet, when my report about Brandon Walsh had been quietly discredited and filed away. When I was a senior here, I learned that the honor code isn't just about individual integrity. It's about institutional courage, the willingness of an organization to support those who speak difficult truths, even when those truths are inconvenient. I talked about the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform, about how protecting the innocent sometimes means confronting the powerful. I explained how real leadership requires creating systems where people can report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation, where victims are protected rather than silenced. But I didn't mention my father by name. I didn't relitigate old grievances or seek vindication for past wounds. Instead, I focused on what the Reeves name could represent going forward. A commitment to justice over comfort, protection over politics, truth over convenience. After the speech, a young female cadet approached me during the reception. "Major Reeves," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you. Your new family advocacy policies helped me report something that happened last semester. For the first time, I felt like the system would actually protect me instead of protecting the person who hurt me. That conversation clarified something fundamental about legacy. I wasn't trying to repair my father's reputation or force him to acknowledge his mistakes. I was building something entirely new, a version of military service that centered protection over power, that measured success by lives saved rather than careers advanced. The speaking engagements multiplied. Military academies, officer training schools, family readiness groups. Each time I spoke not as Colonel James Reeves' disappointing daughter, but as Major Maya Reeves, an officer whose work was preventing the institutional failures that had once defined my own experience. The most meaningful invitation came from the Military Child Education Coalition. They wanted me to address military families about supporting children who choose service paths their parents don't understand or approve of. Standing before an audience of military parents, I talked about the difference between loving someone and controlling them, between supporting their choices and demanding they meet your expectations. Some military families produce multiple generations of service members, I said. But sometimes the greatest gift a military parent can give their child is the freedom to serve in ways the parent never imagined, to excel in areas the parent never valued, to build their own legacy on their own terms. After that speech, a retired colonel approached me with tears in his eyes. My daughter's been trying to get into intelligence work, and I kept pushing her toward infantry. I think I've been making the same mistakes your father made. Thank you for helping me see that. The Reeves name was becoming associated with reform, protection, and progress rather than rigid tradition and institutional protection. I wasn't carrying my father's legacy forward. I was creating my own, one that would outlast his limitations and serve military families long after both of us were gone. The call came at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning in October. I was reviewing case files in my Pentagon office, working late on new family advocacy protocols, when my phone rang with my mother's contact information. Maya, her voice was shaky, distant. Your father had a heart attack. He's at Walter Reed, but the doctors don't think. She couldn't finish the sentence. I sat in my office chair, surrounded by policy documents and case studies, and felt remarkably little. No surge of emotion, no sudden desire to rush to his bedside, no regret about our years of silence. Just a calm acknowledgement that this moment had always been inevitable. Do you want me to come? I asked. I don't know, she said honestly. I think I want you to come for me, not for him. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. I'll be there in an hour. The drive to Walter Reed gave me time to think about what I owed this moment, this man, this relationship that had never really been one. By the time I arrived, my father was unconscious, connected to machines that beeped and hummed in the sterile cardiac intensive care unit. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, older, worn down by years of managing the tension between her husband and daughter. She hugged me with desperate gratitude, whispering thank you for coming, like I'd done something remarkable instead of something basic. We sat beside his bed for 18 hours. My mother talked to him, held his hand, told him I was there. I said nothing, not because I was angry or bitter, but because there was genuinely nothing left to say. We had become strangers years ago, and his impending death didn't change the fundamental truth of our incompatibility. When relatives began arriving, his brother, my cousin's family friends, I watched them struggle with how to interact with me. They'd heard his version of our relationship for years, his complaints about my failures and attitude problems. But they'd also begun hearing different stories recently, whispers about my Pentagon position, my policy work, my speaking engagements at military academies. Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, pulled me aside during one of the many vigils. Maya, I want you to know that some of us always suspected James was wrong about you. Your work with military families, the changes you're making, we're proud of you, even if he couldn't see it. I appreciated his words, but they felt unnecessary. I'd stopped needing family validation years ago, stopped measuring my worth by their understanding or approval. Their recognition was nice but not essential. When my father died at 1847 hours on Friday evening, I felt relief more than grief. Relief that my mother wouldn't have to manage our conflict anymore, that family gatherings could become about connection rather than careful navigation around his need to criticize me. The funeral planning became an exercise in diplomacy. Military protocol demanded certain honors, and I supported those decisions. His service had been genuine, even if his fatherhood had been lacking. I helped my mother choose readings, coordinated with the honor guard, and handled logistics with the efficiency that military training had taught me. But when people expected me to deliver a eulogy full of forgiveness and reconciliation, I simply declined. "I think it's better if someone who knew him well speaks," I told the family. I wasn't going to lie about our relationship for the comfort of mourners who had watched him diminish me for years. The night before the funeral, my mother asked the question I'd been expecting. "Do you forgive him, Maya?" I considered her question carefully. Mom, forgiveness implies that someone has acknowledged wrongdoing and sought to make amends. Dad spent years convinced he was right about me, right about his choices, right about his values. He never apologized because he never believed he'd done anything wrong. "So you don't forgive him?" I don't need to forgive him. I needed to stop letting his limitations define my possibilities, and I did that years ago. His approval was never actually available to me, so I stopped seeking it. That's not forgiveness. That's just acceptance of reality. Standing at Arlington National Cemetery the next morning, watching the honor guard prepare for the ceremony, I understood something fundamental about closure. Real closure doesn't require the other person's participation. It doesn't need dramatic confrontations, tearful reconciliations, or deathbed forgiveness scenes. Sometimes closure looks like showing up with dignity, honoring what was genuinely worthy of honor, and refusing to pretend that dysfunction was love or that silence was acceptance. I was there for my mother, for military protocol, and for my own sense of completion. I wasn't there to forgive someone who had never asked for forgiveness or to mourn someone who had been absent from my life long before he stopped breathing. As the honor guard approaches with 2 flags at my father's funeral, I experienced something I never expected: clarity. The first flag represents his 25 years of legitimate military service, the parts of his career that deserved respect. The second flag represents my own classified achievements that he died never knowing about, never understanding, never acknowledging. I don't need to explain to the assembled mourners why there are 2 flags or what my father missed about my service. The military's recognition speaks for itself. Standing there with my mother clutching both flags against her chest, I finally understand that some truths don't need witnesses to be complete. The 2 flags become perfect symbols. His visible legacy and my hidden one, finally brought together at the moment when his ability to diminish mine ends forever. In the months following the funeral, something remarkable happens. Officers who witnessed my father's treatment now openly acknowledge what they always knew but couldn't say: that his behavior reflected poorly on his character, not mine. My commanding officers begin including my story in leadership training about supporting military families and recognizing excellence in all its forms. The invitations multiply: military academies, congressional briefings, policy conferences. I'm no longer introduced as Colonel Reeves' daughter but as Major Maya Reeves, architect of military family protection policies. The recognition feels different because it's based on my own merit, my own choices, my own contributions to military families across America. My father's friends, the ones who heard years of complaints about my failures, now approach me at military events with awkward admissions. "We always suspected James was wrong about you." Their recognition comes without his apology, and I discover that's perfectly fine. Truth doesn't need everyone's acknowledgement to be valid. I established the Military Family Advocacy Network, a mentorship program for service members whose families don't understand or support their military careers. Every month, I receive emails from young officers facing the isolation I once knew, and I connect them with mentors who value their service regardless of family approval. The program expands beyond individual support to institutional change. We're creating the military family structure I needed. One based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than hierarchy and control. My legacy isn't defined by my father's approval or disapproval, but by the military families I helped protect from the dysfunction I experienced. 6 months after the funeral, I receive a letter that changes everything. It's from Brandon Walsh, the cadet whose assault I reported at West Point. He's writing from federal prison, where he's serving time for the assault at Fort Bragg that was prosecuted using my buried report as evidence of pattern behavior. "Major Reeves," he writes, "I know you'll never forgive me, and you shouldn't. But I wanted you to know that your courage at West Point saved other women from experiencing what my victims endured. Your father may have buried your report, but it eventually buried me. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't changing someone's mind about you. It's changing your own mind about needing their approval. My story isn't one of dramatic reconciliation or tearful forgiveness. It's about something more powerful. The quiet strength that comes from building your own worth independent of toxic validation. Military families face unique pressures, but every family has the potential for members who can't see past their own limitations. My father missed the opportunity to know an extraordinary daughter, but I didn't miss the opportunity to become extraordinary anyway. Real strength doesn't always announce itself with confrontations or apologies. Sometimes it looks like quiet persistence, professional excellence, and the wisdom to know when approval isn't actually available. The two flags at his funeral told the complete story. His legacy and mine, side by side but separate, both worthy of honor but neither dependent on the other for validation. Strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just continues building something better.